It's pretty hard to believe that the Samsung Galaxy S5 is now 5 years old. That's a pretty long time, but the question is it obsolete? In this video, I'll be taking a look at the Galaxy S5 and telling you guys if it's still a good phone in 2019, or if you should just pass it up and find something else. The Galaxy S5 has 2GB of RAM with 11 usable gigabytes of storage on the 16GB model, and can officially run up to Android 6.0 Marshmallow. But what you need to know is in order to update, you sometimes have to have a carrier-specific SIM card. Let's say you have the AT&T variation of the phone, you'll need an AT&T SIM card in order to update it, otherwise you can't update. And the SIM card has to be activated too. But even if you can't, most apps still support 5.0 Lollipop, which is what most S5s are still running. The amount of RAM is okay, and while it's not going to be incredibly fast, it gets the job done most of the time. The only time where I've ever run into trouble is with a few larger games, and if I have too many apps open at the same time. But even then, the phone still runs at an acceptable speed. 2GB of RAM was excellent in 2014, and we've seen flagship phones as late as 2017 only have 2GB of RAM, like the iPhone 8. This phone was ahead of its time in a lot of ways, and was one of the first to include IP67 dust and water resistance. But the biggest problem with the phone is the amount of internal storage. Only 11GB are usable out of the box, and carriers often put bloatware on the phones, so you want to keep that in mind. Fortunately, the Samsung Galaxy S5 has a removable back, allowing you to use a microSD card, and since the back is replaceable, you can also customize your S5. I swapped out the gold for a really pretty metallic blue, and it looks awesome. This also has a feature I really want back on modern flagship phones, the removable battery. The best thing about the Galaxy S5 is just how practical it is. It might not be the sexiest phone out there, but having a removable battery, microSD card slot, and even IP67 water resistance are all things I care about far more than a glass back. In fact, I think Samsung's second biggest misstep was with the Galaxy S6 because of this. Sure, it looked nicer than the S5, but it lacked all those things in exchange for a more quote-unquote premium look. The good news is, the microSD card slot and water resistance came back for Samsung's flagships after the S6. But I would love to see the return of the removable battery on a future Samsung phone that has flagship level specs, even if it's not a Galaxy S or Note. Another thing I absolutely love about the Galaxy S5 is its screen. It has a 5.1-inch AMOLED 1080p screen with no curves or notches in sight. I may be in the minority, but I am a huge fan of just having a flat screen. A 5.1-inch display is really good too, and it's more than enough to keep me happy. I'm very happy Samsung has decided to offer a flat screen option for the S10 with the S10e, and I hope they continue that in the future. But could we please also have the removable battery back too? Overall, things are looking pretty good so far for the S5. Despite the phone being 5 years old, it was ahead of its time in a lot of ways, which is why I think it's held up so well today. But what about the camera? If there's anything on a smartphone that tends to become obsolete quickly, it's the camera. Well, let's take a look. The Galaxy S5 has a 16-megapixel rear camera and a 2-megapixel front camera. The average amount of megapixels for a smartphone today is 13 megapixels, so 16 megapixels is still really good. But that doesn't necessarily mean better photos. If you have really good lighting conditions, the photos turn out beautiful. In fact, they can still hold up to most photos taken on more recent smartphones to this day. They're that good. But when the lights start going out, that's when the problems start to begin. Average lighting still looks alright. I've seen photos worse on phones that are going a little over $400 currently. There's a little bit of noise and they aren't as sharp as I'd like, but they look alright nonetheless. Low light photos don't though. There's a lot of noise and blur, and while you can adjust the exposure, low light photos don't look that good. They aren't horrible, but they can't hold a candle to low light photos taken on more recent phones. Overall, the rear camera is still good, and while it's not as impressive as it was 5 years ago, considering that you can now get this phone for under $100, you could do a lot worse. You can also shoot videos up to 4K and at 60 frames per second, and most of them still look really good. Here are a few videos that I shot with the Galaxy S5, and for a phone that's 5 years old, I'm still pretty impressed. The front camera is only 2 megapixels, but even so, selfies taken with it look decent. Front cameras have come a long way since 2014, and it's clear the front camera hasn't aged that well. It's good enough to get the job done, but it won't knock your socks off. White girls, this is not the phone for you. Overall, the camera on the S5 was really good for its time, but it has absolutely started to show its age. It's still usable, but it could have been better. As I mentioned before, the Galaxy S5 is running Marshmallow and comes with 2GB of RAM. The standard for most smartphones now is at least 4GB of RAM, but even with just 2GB of RAM, the S5 still performs pretty well. It's not the fastest phone in the world, but for most tasks, it performs well. For most basic tasks, the S5 still works very well. If you use your phone to call, text, browse the web, and use a few social media apps here and there, the phone is still perfectly usable. And since the phone has a headphone jack, music is of course always going to be great. But you could always connect Bluetooth headphones if you'd like. But what about more demanding tasks like games and video playback? Most of the games I played on my S5 worked great. I have no issues at all playing most games, and if you're gonna play smaller games like Bejeweled and Sonic the Hedgehog 2, you won't have any issues at all. Heck, most 3D games will work fine as well. As long as you're not playing anything too demanding like Asphalt, you should be fine. But because the internal storage is low, you probably won't be able to download a bunch of games. You can move some of the app to the SD card, but it's still an issue even if you do that. As for videos, they still play fine even at 1080p, just like they did 5 years ago. Whether you're watching Netflix or YouTube, they'll play just fine. Like I said before, this phone was ahead of its time, so that's why it's held up so well. But the question is it obsolete? And should you still get one? Looking back at the Galaxy S5, I'm honestly surprised how well it's held up. It may not be the phone it once was, but it has held up pretty well in most regards, and the only major issues with it are the internal storage and the camera could have been better. But should you get one? If you are looking for a phone that's in the $70 to $100 price range, I'd say it's still a good option because it's held up so well. Or if you're looking for a backup phone, maybe to bring with you on a vacation or something just in case anything happens to your main phone, then yeah, I'd say it's a good option. However, if you're willing to spend a little more, you can get a Galaxy S7 for $40 to $70 more, and that has more RAM, better water resistance, and is overall better than the S5. And since phones depreciate in value, it'll get even cheaper as the months go by. Or if you're not on a budget at all, I'd recommend the S10e for those who really like the S5. The S7 and the S10e have everything the S5 has, except the IR blaster and removable battery. The IR blaster isn't really that big of a deal, and as much as I'd like to see the removable battery come back, most phones haven't had it in quite some time. The main concern you should have when you're getting an S5 now is future-proofing. The phone is already 5 years old, and while most apps are still compatible with it, it's unclear how long apps will still be supported for it. I'd say within 2 to 3 years, less and less apps will be updated and compatible with it, until none are altogether. You'll still be able to use apps, of course, but they won't be able to be updated, and that can cause some problems. In conclusion, the S5 has held up pretty well, but if you're willing to spend a little more, I'd highly recommend the S7 over it. But if you really want a backup phone or a really inexpensive phone, the S5 is still a valuable option, and I recommend it for those reasons. But for someone who is planning to use it as a daily driver, I'm not sure if I would recommend still getting one. The S5 has had a great run and remains one of my favorite phones of all time. The S10e is the closest thing Samsung has made to it in years, but until we get that removable battery back, its practicality is unmatched. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments and keep calm and da-da on.